But first tonight, let's start with some breaking news. Deputy Labor leader Richard Marles has been found to have breached parliamentary rules by failing to disclose a pro-China speech he gave in Beijing that he cleared with the Chinese embassy. Here are the key points I have uncovered. Marles failed to disclose the trip on his pecuniary interest register. This is the register that requires MPs to declare any gifts or sponsored travel worth over $300. Tanya Plibersek and Liberal MP Ted O'Brien, who also went on this trip to Beijing, they both did make the appropriate declarations, but Marles did not. This is in breach of the parliamentary rules. And the Standing Committee of Privileges and Members' Interests has the power to inquire into and report on specific complaints about registering or declaring interests. Now, this trip was organised by a controversial think tank called China Matters. It has had its funding stripped from the Australian government over concerns about its agenda. I've asked Richard Marles about this, and he admits that he didn't declare it as he should have. He said on this occasion, an administrative error was made and part of my trip was paid for by China Matters was not on my register of members' interests as it should have been. I have sought to rectify this. Given the speech he gave on this trip wasn't catalogued on his website, and given that he didn't declare the trip, questions are likely to arise about whether he felt he had something to hide. But Marles says this isn't the case. He said, "My trip to Beijing has not been a secret, has been well covered in multiple newspapers, online coverage, and in several interviews." The broader point here is why Marles didn't declare this. It couldn't really have been a case of forgetting, because he did remember to ask the taxpayer to pay for some of his costs. While China Matters paid for Marles's return flight from Beijing and also his accommodation while he was there, Marles told the think tank that he would pay his own way there because he was going to fly ahead of the rest of the team for some meetings. But he then ended up asking the taxpayer to fund this. As you can see here, he charged the taxpayer $6,191 for travel to China in September 2019. And this is the crucial question, and I'm going to speak to James Patterson, who's chair of the Intelligence Committee, about this in a moment. Should Marles have charged the taxpayer at all for that first part of the trip, given that the meetings he had then and the speech he gave was organised by the Chinese embassy in Canberra? This is effectively the Chinese government. One of the meetings he had in that period before the start of the study tour was with the Vice Minister of the International Department of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. So a senior Chinese Communist Party official, his name is Guo Yazhu. And in this report that you can see now, this report is on the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party website. And in it, the Vice Minister is quoted as saying that the CCP values its links with the Australian Labor Party and wishes to strengthen exchanges between the two parties. This same report quotes Marles as saying, Mr. Marles expressed that the Australian Labor Party is willing to deepen exchanges and cooperation between the two parties so as to promote the development of Australia-China relations. But Marles didn't only meet with a senior Communist Party official on Australian taxpayer dime, he also gave a speech at the Beijing Foreign Studies University, where he was accompanied by government officials. This was a pro-Beijing speech in which he called for closer military ties between China and Australia. He also said China's investment in the Pacific is a good thing and that Australia should welcome it. And I first reported this in the Australian newspaper on Friday. There was one line in the speech that raised the human rights abuses in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. Marles said, "When necessary, we will raise our concerns, as we have, about the minority Uyghur population in Xinjiang or the situation in Hong Kong. We do this on behalf of all Australians who believe people have a right to express their views through peaceful and lawful assembly." You'll recall this was just before the pandemic. This was September 2019, and The Hong Kong protests were a major political issue at the time. Marles defended the right to protest, but he did agree with China that violence can never be condoned, even in the form of protest. Now, here is how the Australian's foreign editor, Greg Sheridan, described the entirety of the speech that Marles gave. And Greg Sheridan wrote this article in the Weekend Australian just this weekend. He wrote, "The speech he made on China in Beijing in 2019 was the worst major speech on China any Labor representative has made for several years." He wrote Marles' speech was one of the very few occasions when Labor gave some sustenance to the government claim, which is mostly false, that it sided with Beijing against Australia so long as the coalition government was in power. That's a very strong piece by Greg Sheridan. I recommend you read it on the Australian website. And here's James Campbell, who's the political editor for the News Corp Sunday papers. He described the speech like this today. He said, "Marles is captured by what I call the Hugh White, Paul Keating doctrine, which can be summed up as the view that China's sun is rising as America sets, and that eventually Australia will have to trim its sails accordingly." Greg Sheridan also made the point that Marles presumably became ashamed of this speech as he no longer has it on his website. But as Sheridan says, you can't simply erase the past. Now, on the front page of the Weekend Australian yesterday, I wrote that Marles provided his speech to the Chinese embassy in Canberra before he left for his trip. Yes, it contained that sentence on Xinjiang that I read to you, but if they were so unhappy with it, they could have stopped him from giving it, or they could have stopped him from going to China altogether. And as you'll recall, just 2 months later, China stopped Andrew Hastie and James Patterson from entering Beijing. But Marles ultimately was allowed to fly to Beijing, and he was allowed to give this speech. Here's Marles defending his decision to share the speech with the embassy before his trip.
Why did you show a speech given to a Beijing university to the Chinese embassy first?
I made a speech in China where I criticised China, and I wanted to make sure that the Chinese government were not at all surprised by the fact of what I was going to say.
I mean, it looked like you're in their pocket, though.
I let the people know what I was going to say, so there were no surprises. But there were no changes whatsoever made to a speech that I made in China, criticising China in public.
Defence Minister Peter Dutton had a different take. He said on Twitter, "The only Australians who think it's okay to have speeches vetted by the Chinese government are Anthony Albanese and Richard Marles." To be clear, the government had no idea that Richard Marles had provided his speech to the Chinese embassy. This is something that I discovered and worked very hard to verify, to stand up. And trust me, that was no easy task. But Penny Wong was out defending the speech this morning on Sky News Agenda. Not one word of criticism. This is the person who will be our foreign minister should Labor win government. And she thinks Marles' comments and the fact he cleared it with the Chinese government apparently are perfectly fine because she didn't condemn it this morning when asked directly about it twice. And ABC journalists also think there's nothing to see here, nothing wrong with allowing the Chinese government to effectively sign off on a speech from an Australian politician who is tipped to be the Defence Minister. And I'll talk about the media's coverage and the ABC's coverage of this in particular later on in the show with Sophie Ellsworth and Nick Cater. And of course, this isn't a case of comments that were made, back in 2019 that were never made again, that it might have been a different time, because Richard Marles did repeat pretty much the same comments in a book he wrote on Pacific nations in August 2021, just 8 months ago. Again, I wrote about this on the front page of The Australian on Friday. No one in Labor has criticised Marles' views. Well, not publicly. None of this means that it's not legitimate to debate foreign policy and what more the Australian government could have done to prevent the Solomons from signing this secret security pact with China. Of course, this should be examined, as it will be in the United States, the UK, Japan, Indonesia and New Zealand. We've known for years that Chinese corruption and influence operations are rife in the Pacific, along with China's debt trap diplomacy. You might remember I had the Premier of the Solomon Islands' most popular province, Premier Daniel Soudani, on my show in June last year. It was an exclusive interview, and he said very clearly that China was bribing senior politicians. He, as the Premier, was even offered a bribe, which he refused. You had just celebrated your win in June 2019 when you were first approached with accepting cash from China in exchange for switching your position, your diplomatic allegiance to China instead of Taiwan. What happened at that time you were offered that bribe?
Thank you, Sharri, for giving me this space. At that time, being the representative of the people of my province, I decided not to take the bribe because I am just a representative. I will always get back to my people, and I will always do what my people like. I believe there is something that is going on between PRC and the national government of Solomon Islands.
The issue of Solomon Islands being influenced by China after bribery and corruption has been going on for several years now. Any viewer of this show and other Sky News shows will have been aware of it. The US, Australia, Japan, the UK, New Zealand have been trying to counter this for years. But suddenly in an election campaign, the Labor Party has woken up to it. I mean, why wasn't this debate happening about what more the government could do to counter this influence in the Pacific in 2019 or at any time since then, including when I broadcast that interview in June last year? Why wasn't Penny Wong holding daily press conferences about this then? And we know the answer to that. There wasn't an election campaign.